Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor here with a extra special. Well, this is like extra special because in a lot of ways, folks, we have the father of so much of the science that we're here talking about. We have a gentleman, a researcher, a doctor, and I think frankly a humanitarian with us who has been telling us this message of healthy fats and sugar and starch are so deleterious to our health for literally decades. That man is none other than the author of the Rosedale Diet. We have Dr. Ron Rosedale himself on the phone. Dr. Rosedale, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here. I look forward to our conversation.
Oh, well, Ron, thank you again for being here. And I think just for the listeners who are not familiar with, certainly this is a crowded space. But it hasn't always been a crowded space. In fact, it was a space of maybe a handful of people decades ago. And you were, if not the first, certainly in that handful. When did you get started? How did you get started? And just tell us your story.
Well, when did I get started? Probably in the late 80s, I suppose, early 90s. And I started in with a practice with another physician who dealt with a lot of cardiovascular patients, and a lot of them had diabetes. And I had treated diabetics quite successfully by a low carbohydrate diet. And the reason I hadn't read about it anywhere, in fact, at the time I never even had heard of Dr. Atkins, who had written about a low carbohydrate previously. But I wasn't into popular books or anything like that. My approach was that it was just foolish to feed diabetics who had a problem with high blood sugar.
Crazy. That's crazy talk, Ron.
Yeah, and it was really, truthfully, that was my first thought. And before that, I might add, I was quite a fan. You might even say it was kind of a hobby next to medical school and next to medicine in the biology of aging. So I had followed the biology of aging quite a bit and recognized the role that glucose and possibly insulin played in the biology of aging, which quite a few years later was very verified when the DAF2 gene was discovered that connected insulin with the actual rate of aging in laboratory animals. But early on in clinical practice, when I was asked to treat cardiovascular patients with diabetes, my very first thought was that really wasn't Einsteinian at all, that it would be wrong to treat a diabetic by feeding them a lot of foods that almost immediately turn to sugar and then give them drugs and insulin to try and lower the sugar. And it's like using a car and driving with the brakes and the accelerator on at the same time. It was just really stupid. So it never even occurred to me to do it any other way. And I remember one of the first patients that I treated after I had joined this other doctor's practice was a very severe diabetic who was on, I think, over 200 units, I think almost 300 units of insulin. Basically, it was like candy for him. And he had severe cardiovascular disease, was on a bunch of blood pressure medications and heart medications, and had neuropathy, which means damage to his nerves in his legs, which is relatively common in diabetics, such that both of his legs were numb up to his thigh. And so I treated him with a very low carbohydrate diet, and right away I knew that a high protein diet was not the way to go. That protein itself I knew could turn to sugar if it was in excess. And so really from 20 years ago or longer, the only nutrient I've had people count was protein. That the less non-fiber carbohydrates, the better. And I differentiated carbohydrates not from simple or complex, but simply whether it turned to sugar or not. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That was whether it had a lot of fiber or not. So fiber doesn't turn to sugar. Any carbohydrate that's not fiber will turn to some sort of sugar, all of which will be bad. And if you eat excess protein, then what your body requires, you'll turn a lot of the excess protein into sugar or other substrates which act just like sugar. And that wouldn't be good for a diabetic either. And so all you were left with was fat. And so the diet that I used right from the very beginning was a very high fat, very low non-fiber carbohydrate, and the appropriate protein for that person's size and activity level. And these people did extremely well. And so this patient I was talking about, one of my first patients, went on this diet, and in a couple of weeks, I was able to get him off of insulin totally.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, the good part about it was that he was taking so much insulin that he was so desensitized to it. I mean, he was so resistant to its action, and it was kind of like candy to him. It didn't do much, but it also didn't do much, and you took him off of it. He was so resistant to it, but taking him off of it got him resensitized. It was like he was like in a room with a very powerful odor so long that he couldn't smell it anymore. And all you had to do is take him out of the room, and he comes back in the room and he can smell it. So he had plenty of insulin that he was manufacturing himself, but his body wasn't able to listen to any insulin because he had been taking so much of it for so long. And by just taking him off the insulin and reducing the amount of insulin his cells were exposed to, they could now essentially smell the insulin again. And even though he was exposed to much less insulin, the action of the insulin was far more powerful than when he had been on 200 or 300 units. Anyway, so he did extremely well. And I remember about maybe a month afterwards, he had already been off of insulin, and his blood sugars and diabetes were already really well controlled. But I remember getting a call from him then, and it might have been 2 months. I don't recall exactly. This is a long time ago now. He called me and said, "You know, Doc, I really, really appreciate you. You've done just wonders for my diabetes, but right now I just hate you." And I said, "Whoa, why? I mean, things were going really well. Why would you hate me?" He said, "Because my legs are killing me."
Oh, no.
It's so painful right now.
Oh, geez.
And he said, "At least before, they didn't hurt." And all I remember to this day, right now, just smiling to myself and telling him, "Cool. That's great that your legs hurt." He didn't know what I meant right away, but I had to explain myself. And I said, "I don't mean it's great that your legs hurt, but what it means is that the nerves are coming back, that they weren't dead. Now that you're on much lower amounts of insulin, your blood sugars are much better controlled, your nerves are coming back to life."
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to hurt, and they might hurt for a while, and we'll cover you with some medications and get you over the hump here. As the weeks go on, I expect that pain to start diminishing until you get full feeling back, and that's exactly what happened. Until he retained full sensation in his leg, the pain went away, and he was back to normal. And I've got many, many stories like that. There was another patient who literally was in the hospital getting ready for his second bypass surgery. And his first bypass surgery was such a horrible experience that this was like in the movies. He literally pulled out his IVs and signed himself out of the hospital against medical advice. And they told him that if he didn't have the second surgery, that he was going to die. And he said, "That's all right. I'd rather be dead than have to go through that again." Mm. And his daughter had come in to see me for a different reason. And basically, his daughter kind of dragged him in, and said, "Well, there's another option here." And again, to make a long story short, he didn't need the surgery any longer. We opened up his arteries. We increased his blood flow a great deal. We got rid of his diabetes, just like in the other patient. He had also had severe diabetes. And he started a big organization called Heart Support of America. He lived for many years longer. And his organization was to inform people about alternatives to having to go through bypass surgery. So there's a lot of things that happened many years ago. The unfortunate part, at the time, there was no such thing as Twitter and Facebook. Yep. So information was disseminated much, much more slowly. And so the doctor I was working with early on was head of a big society it was headquartered in Chicago. It was a society of doctors who had a more open mind to nutrition and other types of therapies. They were all MDs. There were about 200 of them. Anyway, this doctor who was head of this society asked me to speak at their next national convention. And I asked him, well, what do you want to speak about? He said, you got to speak about insulin. You got to speak about what you're doing with these diabetics and really educate them. And I said, well, they must know. I mean, yeah, I know that it's certainly not mainstream to put people on a very low carbohydrate diet. At the time, even though just how long ago this was, the word carb wasn't coined. You know, it was I was using a high fat, very low carbohydrate diet that was unknown to almost everybody. There were, at the time, I didn't know it, but there was Atkins that had done a low carbohydrate diet, but his view on it was for weight loss, and it was very low carbohydrate, and then anything else went high protein, low protein, high fat. Really didn't matter as long as it was low carbohydrate. And then there was another couple, Mike and Mary Ann Eads, who espoused a high protein diet in particular. And then Barry Sears at the time was doing the Zone Diet, just started. Actually, I hadn't even published yet, but he was writing the Zone Diet that later was published. As far as I know, we were the only four groups anyway, that were advocating a low carbohydrate diet. And I think that the Eves and Barry Sears knew each other quite well. Atkins was off somewhere else, and I didn't know any of them. But then we all kind of met at some meetings and bantered around different theories. But when I was first giving this talk at the Great Lakes College of Advancement in Medicine, I believe it was called, in Chicago, nobody had ever heard of any of these terms. And I remember talking, and when he asked me to speak, I did a little research and read about a study by an obscure physician in Toronto named David Jenkins. And he had coined a term called the Glycemic Index, where he was a diabetologist. He was seeing patients with diabetes and treating them. And he decided that he wanted to see what the effect of different foods were on people. For centuries, really, doctors were telling their diabetic patients to eat a certain way. And this was based on absolutely nothing. It was kind of strange, but there was really no science to support any of these recommendations. So he wanted to see what different foods would do to blood sugar. So he basically got 100 people off the street and fed them different foods and measured their blood sugar. And if they raised more rapidly in a certain period of time, they had a so-called higher glycemic index. And these, he decided, were not a very good thing to feed diabetics. So I talked about the glycemic index. Nobody had ever heard of it. Nobody had ever heard of, at the time of even the phrase insulin resistance, that was at the time being researched at Stanford. Gerald Raven had coined a term called Syndrome X, which they now call the metabolic syndrome. And talked about the concept of cells becoming desensitized and resistant to insulin. But none of this had really made its way into clinical medicine. And even at the time, I talked about the importance of a small, dense LDL. And I'm going to mention this now because even today, this is probably going to be very new information for most of your listeners, that so-called bad cholesterol, LDL, is really very irrelevant. And there's really no such thing as good and bad cholesterol. It's the same molecule. And LDL and HDL aren't even cholesterol. They're actually proteins. LDL stands for low-density lipoprotein. HDL stands for high-density lipoprotein. They're proteins that shuttle around the fat-soluble cholesterol. Cholesterol is a fat, kind of a waxy fat, and it's not going to dissolve in the watery environment of the blood. And all fatty molecules have to be carried around by proteins so that they can actually even be carried around in the water of the blood. And it came to my attention 20 years ago that LDL itself wasn't dangerous at all, but if the LDL particle was too small, it got stuck in the between the cells that line the arteries and could set up an inflammation. And the inflammation was really the major key there, and it wasn't really cholesterol causing the problem. It was the fact that the particles were too small. And you can measure, people can get their LDL particle size measured, and it's really the only relevant measurement of LDL. And LDL itself is not bad cholesterol. In fact, it's required. The reason it's going to tissues is so that you can make new cells. You can't make a cell without cholesterol. So I talked about this way back then.
Well, and Ron, just to interject there, because I think that's in some ways a wonderful trend. And I think one of the major, obviously, contributions you've made is you've brought a lot of these things which are still being considered novel now were issues that you brought up so long ago. And my question, my follow-up question is, I mean, let's take an example here. Like at this point, when you were bringing this up before anyone else did, but at this point, it's acknowledged biology. Things like white rice and white potatoes cause a surge of blood sugar. Now, they may not contain a bunch of toxins, but like it is just a biological fact that they cause a surge in blood sugar. And like, why is there any, help me understand why anyone might say you should eat those foods instead of other less blood sugar damaging foods?
I think the reason, and that's a great question, and I've scratched my head on that ever since I started treating patients, which was unfortunately at this point a long time ago. That why would people, especially feed a diabetic, foods that turn into sugar when they're trying to lower their sugar? And we know, as you mentioned, that when you eat starches such as rice and potatoes and cereal and bread and pasta, that they'll readily turn into glucose and be absorbed as such and raise a diabetic's blood sugar who are being treated to lower their blood sugar. It's being considered, it's defined basically, not basically, but diabetes is defined as an elevation in blood sugar, and diabetics can't handle blood sugar. And here, the recommendation are force feeding diabetics sugar.
Let's put sugar in their blood. That's what we're doing.
Exactly. And then give them medications to lower it. And even today, the recommendation by the American Diabetes Association for patients is to eat anything they want as long as they take enough insulin to lower it. And so the very first talk I gave on this was called "What About Insulin?" What about the problems with taking insulin? And I talked about the physiology of insulin. And a lot of this came right from textbook of physiology. Guyton's textbook of physiology had a lot of this information 20 years ago, and it was the most widely read physiology textbook in medical schools at the time by a long shot. And in it, it mentioned that when insulin goes high, it turns off the ability to burn fat, and that it makes fat. And I presented a slide that shows a study by Anatolia Cruz at the time, who in the 1970s, I think, I was doing experiments on dogs for diabetes, and he had insulin being infused into the femoral artery of a dog. It's a big artery that goes down the leg. And he noted at the end of his experiment that the artery that had insulin being put into it and being infused into it, dripped into it, was almost totally filled up with plaque, like people get in the coronary arteries and they get heart disease. But the other side didn't. He determined that just the contact of insulin on the lining of the arteries caused it essentially to get fat and plug up. And I went through many, many other adverse effects of insulin, including the constriction, the narrowing of arteries, causes blood to clot too readily, increases inflammation, all the different elements that people end up with heart disease, they will get from high insulin more than the high sugar even. And so by taking insulin to lower blood sugar, what's happening is that people are substituting one evil for a worse evil.
Absolutely. And you can't. I mean, it would be like, I mean, just like you said, I can't put it any better than you did. You're substituting one evil for another. It's not a good thing.
No, and this really, I think, is a message that really, really has to get out there. And I'll applaud you for helping to get the message out there. The Accord study was a study done a few years ago, and I need to bring it to people's attention because it's a very big study that was done by a pharmaceutical company, and they were so certain as to what the results would be that the study was fairly well publicized prior to the results coming in, which is unusual. The vast majority of time that a study is done, a medical study is done by a pharmaceutical company. I think 75% of all medical studies are financed by the pharmaceutical industry these days, and they don't do the studies to further some truth. They do it as part of their marketing campaign to get their drug used. And they typically don't publicize studies until the results are in and they know the results are good, because if they're not good, you'll never hear about that study. But this one, they were so certain that if they controlled blood sugar better, in other words, if they gave more medications, what it turns out, to keep a diabetic's blood sugar under better control, which typically is measured by something called the hemoglobin A1C, which kind of measures what they say is an average blood sugar over 3 months, which really isn't, but I won't go into that right now. But that they would have a better long-term outcome, fewer side effects and less death. And it turned out after a couple of years into the study, it was supposed to be a 5-year study or something in that neighborhood, they had to stop the study because so many more people were dying that had their blood sugars better controlled.
Oh, jeez.
Now, this really had people scratching their head and doctors just totally confused. And the results for them were first publicized by Gina Coletta from the New York Times. And a lot of letters to the editor by big diabetic groups, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, all sorts of places. And they published several of the letters, and most of them, almost all of them, were saying, well, still, we know that controlling a diabetic's blood sugar is good. So, let's not stop what we're doing. There must be a reason that this study, didn't show what we wanted it to, and that people were dying when they were having their blood sugar better controlled. Maybe their sugars were going too low and this sort of thing. And I wrote a letter to them that said they should have predicted this, that what was happening is that almost all of the medications, including insulin that is being used to treat diabetics, raise insulin. And all that's doing is exchanging one evil for a worse evil.
Well, and Ron, it seems, I mean, call me crazy. I mean, I do not have an MD, but there's also another treatment here. It's eliminate foods that cause blood sugar to rise in the first place. Like we could spend billions of dollars trying to invent a drug that mitigates what smoking does to your lungs, or attempts to, or like maybe helps you grow another pair of lungs. Or we could just say, don't smoke. Like just breathe in clean air and you'll be all right.
No, I totally agree. Or even more elegant, I suppose. It takes a little more work, I suppose. But just improve insulin sensitivity, and they both will do the same thing. So don't feed sugar, and you keep insulin down. You improve insulin sensitivity, and then you have the better of everything.
Absolutely.
You have the action of insulin without and lowering blood sugar, but without having to raise insulin, and you don't have to worry about having to choose one evil from another. You've got two benefits.
Absolutely. Well, and Ron, let's go on to the second big contribution. I mean, there's certainly been many, but insulin, it's certainly something that's been talked about a lot, gotten a lot of press. Apparently, still not enough because there's still things, like the China study and yada, 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 which make it seem like, oh, yeah, as long as it's the plant, it's good for you. But, okay, well, that's not true. But there's this other really important hormone, which is involved in, you have a line that you use, which I just love, and you say that people do not become fat because they eat fat. They become fat because they cannot burn it. And that is I use a clog sink metaphor, and we talk about like two very important hormones are insulin, as we've already covered, but also leptin, which I know obviously your book dives deeply into this. Can you talk just briefly from a high level of the critical role that leptin plays here?
Yeah, sure. And I can, at the same time, I can answer your last question a little bit more about why doctors recommend a high carbohydrate diet for diabetics, even though it turns into sugar. Mm-hmm. And the reason has to do with a paranoia, really, and it's a misguided paranoia about fat. That I'm sure most of your listeners, and I did probably when I was in high school, you think of doctors as really being in an echelon of intelligent people that really know what they're doing and that you can trust their advice. But when one realizes where the advice to eat a high carbohydrate diet comes from, you have to really question that. And it comes from the fact that they picture arteries as like the copper pipes that are in your kitchen plumbing, and that they'll get plugged up with fat. And that's how you die of a heart attack. That if you eat fat, it will plug up your arteries and you get a heart attack. And therefore they knew that cardiovascular disease was a high incidence in diabetics. And so they said, well, you better not eat fat. And that means that you should eat carbohydrates because high carbohydrate foods don't have a lot of fat, and then you're not going to plug your arteries. But I call this kindergarten thinking because it really is. They're missing everything they were taught in medical school. They're missing all science.
Well, and I always say, too, that, vegetables are also solid at room temperature, so why don't they get stuck in your arteries, too?
Oh, yeah, exactly. But what they're missing is that people the body doesn't work by things haphazardly happening. They work by signals, that we're 15 trillion cells that have to work collectively as one so that we think of ourselves as a single individual. And that collective activity is going to be coordinated and orchestrated by hormones. And if your arteries are getting plugged up with fat, it's because you've got hormones that are misplacing that fat. That, number one, it's not putting it where it's supposed to put it if you do have excess fat, which would be under your skin subcutaneously, and it's growing in places it shouldn't grow, and that you're not able to burn it. You can't burn that fat because it's being eaten and not burned, or you're actually making too much fat out of glucose. You're eating the high carbohydrate diet that they're telling people to eat will turn to glucose. That glucose will turn into palmitic acid, which is supposedly the worst kind of the saturated fat. So when they tell you to eat a low saturated fat, high carbohydrate diet, that's an impossibility. That's an oxymoron, because all that sugar and glucose that you're eating is going to be turned into supposedly the worst saturated fat that you can eat. And that's what they're telling people to eat, and that is what happens. And it's mediated through hormones. And the major hormone that mediates fat physiology is leptin. And if leptin is not working properly, not only can you not burn fat appropriately, but it will be stored in all the wrong places. And the purpose of leptin is to regulate the amount of fat being stored and where it's being stored. And we know now that it goes way, way beyond that into controlling reproduction and thyroid activity and inflammation and cortisol. It controls almost everything because it controls the hypothalamus, which is kind of this central switchboard in the brain that regulates pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm.
and it's greatly involved in the actual aging process.
Well, and just Dr. Rudd, just a quick aside, you mean that the brain regulates things and that we don't need to just consciously count calories in, calories out? You mean that our brain is involved in this in some way?
Yeah, our brain, pretty much regulates everything. We know, for instance, that your listenership, I'm sure, is going to be really surprised about all of this, that calcium has nothing to do with bone strength or even building bone. That has to do with the amount of protein that's in the bone. And that's built by certain cells in bones that have long been known, called osteoclasts. And your bone has to be remodeled all the time, meaning that we have the bone is being built by osteoblasts and being torn down by osteoclasts so that your bone stays strong. We constantly need to break down our bone and build it up, and this is regulated also by leptin through the vagus nerve in the brain. We know that the brain actually controls how much glucose the liver makes. So that when persons become diabetic, it's because the liver is making too much because it's getting the wrong signal to stop making sugar. Typically what happens is when your sugar levels go up, there's a signal that goes to your liver, tells your liver, we got plenty of sugar around, we don't need any more, you can stop making it, because you don't have to eat any sugar the rest of your life. In fact, it would probably be preferable if you never did, because your liver will make exactly what you need. That's the basis of the safe starch debate we can talk about later. And that's fine and dandy, but if your liver never gets the message, so if your sugar goes up, but your liver is not getting the message that you've got plenty of sugar around, it thinks you don't have enough sugar around for so-called anaerobic emergencies. You can burn sugar without oxygen, and so if we have to sprint or fight a saber-toothed tiger or run away from a robber, we can't breathe fast enough to supply enough oxygen. And so we need a fuel that you can burn without oxygen, which is glucose. That's why we have glucose around. And so your liver will make sure we have enough glucose in our bloodstream to meet any potential so-called anaerobic emergency. But if it doesn't get the message to quit making it, it just keeps making it. And so you have liver insulin resistance. Liver is supposed to shut off the liver. But we know now that leptin controls through the brain and the hypothalamus in the brain, through the vagus nerve and the sympathetic nervous system, the amount of sugar that the liver will make. It controls the bone being remodeled. It controls fertility, ovarian function. It controls everything that the hypothalamus controls, which is virtually everything. Your rate of breathing, your body temperature, all the things that are required for life that you don't think about is controlled by leptin through the hypothalamus that then sends out signals to other endocrine glands that make hormones that then it's like a military where you have the 4-star generals telling the 3-star generals telling the colonels and telling the lieutenants and captains and privates, glucose is a private. So glucose is just listening to orders. So diabetes is not even a disease of blood sugar. And yet the reason that we're not making any headway in controlling diabetes is because doctors don't even know what the disease is. It's being mislabeled. And so it's being called the disease of blood sugar. And so they're taking drugs and they're taking insulin to keep sugar down when that's not the problem. The problem is the inability to properly listen to insulin, and even more importantly, the inability to listen to leptin. And until those work properly, until the generals are giving the proper orders, the privates are always going to do the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. And that means glucose is going to go up. And if you just lower sugar at the expense of making insulin signaling and leptin signaling worse, well, then you're not only messing up the blood sugar control, but you're messing up all of the other things that insulin and leptin do, which regulate your ability to burn fat. And that includes whether the lining of your arteries can burn fat or not, and whether they'll get plugged up with fat, and whether your bone gets remodeled properly, i.e. strong bones, and whether too much sugar is going to be controlled, too much sugar is going to be made by the liver because leptin signaling is messed up. There's so much other venues that insulin and leptin control that is being left totally mistreated. So in the Accord study, what it showed was that if you just concentrated on lowering sugar, people died more.
Mm-hmm.
And I will make a statement that is probably going to infuriate all sorts of people, but I'm used to that.
Well, you heard it here first, folks.
Yeah. And that is this. And the Accord study is just one study. There's a lot of cholesterol studies that show the same thing. You can divide medicine basically into two kinds of medicine. You've got critical care medicine and emergency room. And to me, that's where the miracles in medicine lie. That's great. And if I were to get in a car accident, then please take me to the emergency room and keep me alive until tomorrow. And they do a great job at that. So the next thing I'm going to say, I want to exclude the miraculous venues in critical and emergency room care. The rest of what I'm talking about is the treatment of the more chronically ill, the medicine as we know it, everything outside of emergency room. So the treatment of heart disease and cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity and osteoporosis. And what I think, and what I really think that the statistics are supporting, is that if we just did away with it all, we would be better off.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not just saying that flippantly. That doesn't mean that it doesn't do any good. For certain patients, chronic medical care does some good. But for every patient that it does good, it probably does more harm to two people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Ron, just a quick analogy. A gentleman named Adam Kozlov helped to develop where what we're talking about here, just to bring it home for some of the listeners, is we're talking about both diabetes, obesity. A lot of these things are deep deregulation of core processes in the body. It's a hormonal dysregulation, it's a neural dysregulation. Like the body is designed to regulate these things. It's a brilliantly complicated, brilliant system, which is designed to keep us healthy. Like that's all of life is meant to propagate life. But what we do with some of these brute force medications, which you talk about as like this double whammy, the analogy that Adam used was it's like taking someone that has a fever because they have some infection and submerging them in an ice bath until they become hypothermic, where you're like, oh, look, you're cold now. But wait, you still have this chronic infection, and now you have hypothermia. So what the hell is the point?
Yeah, well, that too. But even what I would look at it, that and more, that the reason we have a fever when we get an infection is to perk up our immune system. 15 billion years of nature has developed us such that we have an intrinsic knowledge, as you mentioned, to be healthy. And so we get a fever to help fight the infection. The first thing that medicine does is tell you to take a Tylenol or an aspirin to bring your fever down. That's undoing all of nature's evolutionary education on how to deal with the disease. You get a runny nose because you've got a cold, you take a decongestant. Your doctor will prescribe and tell you to. And the reason you have a runny nose is not to cause misery, but to cleanse the mucous membranes that have become infected. It washes out the offending agents. And so the first thing that we tell you to do is take a decongestant. Again, undoing billions of years of evolutionary knowledge on how to treat that infection. Mm-hmm. And I worked early on in my medical career in ear, nose, and throat. I cannot tell you how many people I saw that had been on decongestants that now came in with a really bad sinus infection because the sinuses couldn't drain because the secretions were too thick and gummy. They couldn't drain out of the sinus, and they just ended up stagnating and getting infected. Then we'd have to go into the sinuses and drain them out like a big abscess. So you have to, as you say, understand the complexity of how we work. that you don't get heart disease, you don't get coronary artery disease, you don't get heart attacks because you've eaten fat and it plugged up your arteries. It does not work that way. It's not even remotely similar to how it works. You go through hormones and instructions that regulates this complex machinery. The way I analogize this secondary part of medicine outside of critical and emergency care, where treating the symptom is a good thing, where if you're bleeding to death, hey, stop that bleeding. It's pretty apparent. And if you adversely affect other systems of the body, well, that's okay, because that person's going to be dead if you don't stop that bleeding. And so that's good. Outside of that, though, you have to take into account the full complexity. And it would be like me, for instance, trying to fix a TV that didn't work. Well, I don't know how that TV works entirely. So if I were to go in the back and see all these wires and try and move some wires to figure out why that TV is not working, the chances of my doing benefit versus doing more harm are infinitesimally small. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to do benefit. I'm going to most likely do harm. And that's what's happening. And that's what the Accord study showed, that as we try and treat diabetics more to bring their sugars more in line with what is considered normal, we make that person worse. We give them more hypertension. We know that taking insulin makes people fat. But taking the vast majority of drugs that treat insulin also makes them fat. So here they're lowering sugar, which is carbohydrate, which they're being told to eat to prevent from being fat. And yet by lowering the sugar, they're getting fatter. Wow, why is that? That's because you're dysregulating the hormones that regulate whether you get fat or not. And the primary one, the 4-star general in the body, is leptin, that controls everything.
And Ron, I love, and for listeners, I know we've gone a little bit deep in this episode, but I think that's actually wonderful, because the more we can understand, like Ron is explaining so beautifully here, that like there's a lot going on in the body, right? And when we don't eat the right kinds of fuel, types of fuel that facilitates that, we can personify it, call that wisdom of the body, which is just a self-perpetuating system. The system doesn't want to go away. And then we try to come in and tweak that system. I forget who said this. It wasn't me, Ron, but there's no such thing as side effects. There's just effects.
Right.
If you inject insulin into the body, it might do one thing which you perceive as good, but it just does things. Like, we can call one of them good, but it's going to do a lot of things. So I think the thing that worries me sometimes, Ron, is that, for example, diabetes, people are like, oh, diabetes isn't a big deal because you can just take insulin. Like, you can deal with it. No, anytime you become dysregulated and anytime the body is malfunctioning, once we've broken our body, there is no just like come in and put a Band-Aid on it unless you're bleeding. Like, when it's that deep internal deregulation, it is so key to just avoid that in the first place by maintaining the natural health of the system through proper nutrition, stress, sleep, all those kinds of things.
And that's, very elegantly said. And I might add that even if you do get it dysregulated, you actually can get it re-regulated if you get deep enough. So, for instance, we can re-regulate leptin if it's being improperly signaled, which it is in almost everybody, by diet, though. There are no drugs to do it. That all of these very critical hormones that we're talking about, such as insulin and leptin, are controlled by diet. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that as life evolved from minerals, from nothing, that there were two things that were mandated in our evolutionary history such that life could perpetuate itself, and that was to eat and reproduce, and each supports the other. So everything was built upon that. In other words, every aspect of our physiology is designed to eat properly and such that we could then reproduce another life to eat properly so that it can also then reproduce. And that is fortunate because that is what is allowing you and I to talk today. That mandate and that all of our ancestors were able to eat. But for a long, healthy life, we have to look at the science that allows us to live pre-reproductively and apply it post-reproductively. In other words, evolution is for reproduction. And we can know what nature's, what guides nature. And it's important to know that. And we know that insulin is very important for cellular reproduction, and leptin is extremely important for multicellular organisms to reproduce like us. And that they also regulate food. And the reason it is so important is that fuel availability dictates reproduction. In other words, any mother will tell you that they're eating for two. And that we know that if there isn't a lot of fuel available, that biological systems are pretty smart, and they will alter the way that their genes are being read such that life, that organism, can live longer so that it can reproduce into a future, more opportune time. So it totally re-regulates our genetics such that we can heal better. So when you keep insulin low and leptin low, it actually reduces the rate of aging while it increases our rate of repair. And it reduces damage and increases repair, and that slows down actually the actual rate of aging. In other words, we're healthier. And it's controlled by these really powerful hormones. So the purpose of insulin, for instance, actually, and this also will surprise people, but I've been saying it for decades, the purpose of insulin has nothing to do with controlling blood sugar. The purpose of insulin has to do with controlling cellular life. And when insulin is high, it's a signal for cells to reproduce. And as such, it's making babies. The parents then become irrelevant, and it accelerates aging. I said this decades ago, and subsequently it was found that insulin regulates aging. And this is done by people who are going to be getting the Nobel Prize, Cynthia Kenyon, for instance, and Daniel Rovkin, who found a genetic pathway that actually, the first genetic pathway that was ever found, and Tom Johnson, I might add, University of Colorado, found the first gene that was involved in this genetic pathway that regulates the aging process. And when you decrease signals to this pathway, you greatly extend health and lifespan. And this is information now that has been around for maybe 15 years, but it hasn't made its way into the clinical practice. And I'm sure most of the listeners out there have never even heard of this. That you can take a mouse, for instance, that has a normal lifespan of 2 years and allow it to live for 3.5 or 4 years. Like taking a human, an average human, and allowing that human to live to 140 years old. The knowledge we have now can do that. And these pathways are all nutrient-sensing pathways. They're really, really powerful, that are regulated by the 3 major nutrient sensors that regulate the 3 major macronutrients. So you've got insulin for carbohydrates, and you've got leptin for fat, and you've got a pathway known as mTOR for protein. And if you regulate these, you get healthy because you're getting really deep, really deep into the workings of our complex system, but that if you just are on the surface, you'll never figure out. You'll always have detrimental effects. But if you get leptin working properly, then all of the things that leptin is giving orders to will start working properly too, such as your ability to burn fat in your arteries, in your liver, in your everywhere. It will start regulating your ability to manufacture bone properly. It'll regulate your thyroid properly. It'll do all these great things because it has so many effects. You have to get it to work properly. But instead, what medicine is doing is the opposite. It's treating diabetes as if it's a disease of blood sugar, and almost every therapy raises insulin, which actually accelerates aging, turns off your ability to repair, causes a dysregulation in your ability to sense insulin itself, so you become insulin resistant. So the insulin then is high all the time, which tells you to stop burning fat, which is how you get fat, like you mentioned. And all of the different things that insulin does, which has to do with coordinating nutrient availability with cellular reproduction, gets messed up, which is why we know now that, for instance, when you accelerate insulin, such as all the medications that people take for diabetes, almost, you increase risk of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is something that basic insulin physiology tells you that I talked about decades ago. It is now being verified more and more, but it's, as Al Gore said, the inconvenient truth. People don't want to hear it because all the drugs treat, supposedly diabetes. I shouldn't say it treats diabetes. It's not treating diabetes. It's treating elevated blood sugar.
Yeah,
that is not the same thing.
Absolutely. Diabetes is a name of a dysregulation, and elevated blood sugar is a symptom.
Exactly. So it treats the one symptom, but it actually causes the underlying cause, such as insulin resistance and leptin resistance, to get worse.
And it causes other problems.
And it causes
it creates new
cancer,
causes.
And it causes death. So you die with better control of your blood sugar. and the same thing with cholesterol. Again, your listenership has no idea that studies since the 1970s have shown that when you lower cholesterol to the levels that are being recommended for the last several decades, you greatly increase your risk of total mortality. So you die with a lower risk of heart disease.
I think I might have to get a T-shirt made of what you just said. But it's okay because you'll die with a lower chance of getting heart disease.
And that's true. Notice that everything they say about statin cholesterol-lowering drugs has to do with lowering your risk of heart disease.
It doesn't. It's true.
It's a little fine print. Yeah, but you'll increase your risk of dying, but that's okay.
But you won't die of heart disease at least.
And the stupid part is you actually will die of heart disease too. So,
I realize this is a bit of a funny, morbid note here, but actually I love to end on laughter, and you've already shared so much of your time with us. And folks, if you haven't checked out Dr. Rosedale's work, please do check out drrosedale.com. I mean, as you can hear from this conversation, Ron has spent a long and very heavily researched life really just getting at truth. I mean, he has no agenda here. I mean, you could hear he's saying things that certainly aren't going to win him any friends necessarily. I mean, I'm his friend, but outside of me,
I've got one friend. Hey,
friends that have enough money to make his life interesting. Let's put it that way. Of which I am not one. So, and of course, he has a book which is all about hormones, like we love to talk about, especially leptin and insulin, as we've talked about, and that's called the Rosedale Diet, which if you haven't picked up, please do grab a copy of. And Dr. Rosedale, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. I can only imagine how much you have going on. So we'll definitely have to have you back. And I really, really appreciate all the work you've done over the years. And again, thank you for sharing all this insight and even a little bit of laughter with us today.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for helping get this information out there. And it was a lot of fun. And people want more information, deeper knowledge, they can also go to the website.
Absolutely, and that's drrosedale.com. And folks, thank you again for listening. And remember, this week and every week afterwards, eat more and exercise less, but do that smarter. Talk to you soon.